In a heartwarming twist of fate, a waitress in a small diner goes out of her way to help a homeless man, not knowing he's someone who has touched the hearts of millions around the world. She never expected to discover that the man she had just served was none other than the legendary Keanu Reeves. Stay tuned as we dive into this touching moment of kindness. Don't forget to comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Emily had just clocked in for her afternoon shift at the roadside diner. Stepping out back to toss some stale bread and potato peels into the trash, she noticed a man crouched next to the dumpster. His clothes were grimy and his disheveled hair stuck out in wild tufts. He looked exhausted, like sleep had been a luxury he couldn't afford for days. For a moment, Emily froze. Her pulse quickened as she studied him from a distance, uncertain if he posed a threat. When he glanced up, her apprehension softened. His eyes didn't carry the anger or desperation she'd occasionally seen in other drifters. Instead, they held a quiet fear, like he was bracing for someone to shout or chase him off. Emily steadied herself and offered a small, tentative smile. "Are you hungry?" she asked softly. He gave a slow, almost reluctant nod. Without a second thought, Emily turned and headed back inside. She knew Janice, her boss, wouldn't approve of giving away food for free, but Emily couldn't bring herself to let the man go hungry. There was plenty of food thrown out each day. Surely no one would miss a simple plate of leftovers. She scooped scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast onto a plate. As she moved toward the door, plate in hand, Janice intercepted her. "Emily, what do you think you're doing? We can't just hand out food," Janice said, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Emily stood firm. "If it's a problem, I'll cover it with my tips, but I'm giving him something to eat," she replied, her tone unwavering. Without waiting for a response, she slipped back outside and handed the plate to the man. He accepted it cautiously, as if kindness was a foreign concept to him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low and rough. Emily gave a small nod and stepped back, careful not to make him feel like a spectacle. Yet she couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered. Something about him didn't fit the image of a typical homeless man. Despite his worn appearance, there was a certain dignity in the way he held himself. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, seemed to hide a story untold. Back inside the diner, Emily tried to focus on her customers, but her thoughts kept drifting to the man outside. She caught herself glancing out the window every few minutes, wondering if he was still there. A subtle but persistent buzz of curiosity gnawed at her, as if this small moment of kindness had unknowingly set something significant in motion. When she looked again, he was still by the dumpster finishing his meal. He wasn't devouring the food with the urgency of someone starving. Instead, he ate slowly, deliberately, with a sense of control that seemed oddly out of place. Emily's chest tightened with intrigue. Who was he? During a lull, she stepped outside again. Her pulse quickened as she approached, half expecting him to have disappeared. But he hadn't. He was leaning against the wall, the empty plate placed neatly at his feet. "Thanks again," he said, his voice calmer now. "No problem," Emily replied, leaning against the brick wall beside him. "Everyone deserves a hot meal." She hesitated before asking what had been on her mind. "Have we met before?" "You look familiar." He let out a soft laugh, more like an exhale. "I doubt it," he said, his eyes darting briefly as though ensuring they weren't being overheard. Emily frowned slightly, her curiosity only deepening. Something about his demeanor felt important. "Are you sure?" she pressed. "You don't seem like someone who's used to this." She gestured vaguely at the alley, the trash, the rough conditions surrounding them. He averted his gaze, his expression unreadable. After a pause, he said, "I've been a lot of places." His tone giving nothing away. Emily opened her mouth to ask more, but the sound of the back door swinging open made her jump. The moment passed, leaving questions that lingered like a whisper she couldn't quite catch. Janice stood at the door, her glare bouncing between Emily and the man outside. "Emily, get back inside, we can't have this," she snapped. Emily hesitated, a strange feeling gnawing at her like she was on the verge of uncovering something important. She gave a small nod and went back inside, but her mind stayed outside with him. As she took orders, she couldn't stop thinking about the man. Why was he so polite? Why did he feel so familiar? She pictured him in a suit, standing behind a podium, delivering a speech, completely out of place in that grimy alley. Could he have been someone important who had lost everything? The idea seemed ridiculous, but her gut told her otherwise. There was an electricity in the air, like the moments before a storm. She needed to talk to him again, to solve this puzzle. But when her shift ended, he was gone. Emily sighed, a strange mix of curiosity and disappointment swirling in her chest. Feeding him had been simple enough, but the hunger to know more about him was just beginning. 2 days later, she spotted him again. Her breath hitched as she froze mid-step. It was early afternoon, and the diner buzzed with activity, but all Emily could focus on was him. He lingered near the parking lot sign, his eyes scanning the area like he was on edge, expecting someone to catch him. Emily couldn't ignore him. She grabbed a paper bag, stuffed a sandwich inside, and walked out, her heart racing with every step. She approached quietly, and to her relief, he didn't run. She held out the bag, and he nodded as he accepted it. "And you came back," she said, her voice steady, though her thoughts were anything but. "Just passing through," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the ground. He didn't eat right away, instead studying her face intently. "Why are you helping me?" he asked suddenly. "You know you could get in trouble for this." Emily shrugged. "It just feels like the right thing to do." "I don't know who you are, but you needed help." She paused, her curiosity breaking through. "Are you sure we haven't met before? Maybe I've seen you on TV or something?" The question made him tense. For a moment, she thought he might leave. Then, softly, he said, "I'd rather keep my life before this. Private, if you don't mind." Her heart raced. He was hiding something, but what? Was he a disgraced CEO or a millionaire who'd lost it all? Her mind spun with possibilities. As absurd as it sounded, she even thought of Keanu Reeves. It was ridiculous, of course, but the idea clung to her, fueled by his careful speech and slight accent. "Thank you for the sandwich," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've reminded me there's still kindness in the world." With that, he stepped back, signaling he wouldn't answer any more questions. Emily felt a rush of excitement, the kind that came with standing at the edge of a monumental discovery. As she returned to the diner, her thoughts swirled. If her hunch was right, the man outside wasn't just anyone. He was someone powerful, someone whose fall from grace would shock the world. Over the next few days, Emily couldn't stop thinking about him. She glanced out the window during her shifts, hoping to catch another glimpse. Just as she began to think he'd moved on, he appeared again one evening after the dinner rush. Emily's pulse quickened when she saw him standing near the side entrance. She waited until Janice disappeared into the stockroom before slipping outside. This time, she noticed a faint bruise on his temple. A fresh wave of nervous energy coursed through her. Whatever his story was, it was deeper and more complicated than she'd imagined. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, resting a hand on his arm. He gently pulled away, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he replied, though the faint wince on his face betrayed him. Emily frowned, a pang of concern rising in her chest. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here," she offered, her voice quiet but steady. He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You're kind, but this isn't something you can fix." His tone was calm, yet laced with a sadness that made her chest tighten. Now she was certain he was hiding something or someone. "I'm just trying to figure things out," he added, his words vague but weighted. Emily's stomach churned as if she were on the brink of uncovering a significant secret. The thought crossed her mind like a lightning bolt. Could he be Keanu Reeves? The idea seemed absurd, yet the clues were impossible to ignore. The faint accent, the measured way he spoke, the undeniable intelligence in his demeanor. She'd watched enough interviews to recognize those traits. But he didn't elaborate. Instead, he simply said, "I should go," and vanished into the shadows. Emily stood frozen in place, staring down the empty alley. Frustration bubbled inside her. She still didn't have answers. Back in the diner, Janice noticed Emily's distracted look, but said nothing. The night slowed as customers trickled out, and soon her shift would end. Yet her mind buzzed with possibilities. What if her hunch was right? Should she confront him, or stay quiet and continue helping him? A spark of excitement surged through her. If he truly was Keanu Reeves, what was he doing living like this? Was it a social experiment to see how people treated him without his wealth and fame? She resolved to confront him the next time she saw him. She needed to know. As Emily locked up the diner, she glanced into the darkness behind the building. She whispered under her breath, "If it's really you, I'll find out soon." Her thoughts spiraled as she clutched the counter, startled by the TV suddenly broadcasting a press conference featuring Keanu Reeves. The old screen above the grill showed Keanu, polished and confident, discussing rockets and electric cars. Her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized his face, his voice, the subtle accent. It was identical to the man outside. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The stranger wasn't just anyone. He was Keanu Reeves. It sounded insane, but every instinct told her it was true. She replayed his quiet demeanor, his sincere thank yous, the familiarity she couldn't place earlier. Everything made sense now. That night, Emily lingered in the shadows outside the diner, waiting. She felt ridiculous, but she couldn't let it go. After half an hour, she spotted a figure at the alley's edge. Her heart raced as she stepped forward. Standing beneath a dim streetlight, she took a deep breath. "I know who you are," she said, her voice trembling. He froze, his gaze locking onto hers. The silence stretched until he sighed, lowering his head. "I thought I was careful," he admitted quietly. "But I guess not careful enough." Her heart leapt. "So it's true? You're really Keanu Reeves?" The words sounded absurd, but he didn't deny them. Instead, he nodded. "Yes, it's me." His voice softened as he continued. "I needed to know how it feels to be invisible again, to see if people would show kindness without knowing who I am." The weight of his words struck her. Emily felt a mixture of awe and disbelief. "But why here? Why this diner?" she pressed, her voice unsteady. Keanu ran a hand over his face, smudging the dirt there. "I've been moving from place to place, avoiding attention. I wanted to witness genuine kindness, not something driven by recognition." Emily's mind reeled. She'd fed him, worried for him, and now learned it was part of his quest for authentic human connection. She felt honored, but also slightly deceived, grappling with the weight of the truth. "What happens now?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely more than a whisper. Keanu turned to her, his gaze gentle, almost comforting. "I go back to my life," he said simply. "But this place, what you did for me, I'll never forget it," he continued. "You reminded me that goodness still exists in the world, that kindness hasn't vanished." Her heart swelled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had contributed to something much greater than herself. She nodded, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. The night was cool, the air crisp, and the parking lot around them was eerily quiet, amplifying the weight of their conversation. Emily couldn't shake the realization that her small, unassuming gesture had shifted his perspective of the world, even if only a little. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked, her curiosity overtaking her hesitation. They stood together in the dimly lit alley as Keanu shared his reasons. He explained that he'd grown disillusioned with how people treated him, how his name, his wealth, and his status seemed to change their behavior. "I wanted to know how strangers would act if they believed I had nothing," he admitted. "It's a personal journey, an experiment of sorts." Emily tried to absorb his words. On one hand, the idea struck her as strange. One of the wealthiest men in the world wandering around, dressed like someone who had lost everything, testing the kindness of others. But on the other hand, she couldn't help but admire the courage it must have taken to step away from the comfort and privilege of his life, even temporarily. A whirlwind of emotions swept through her. Pride in having played a part, curiosity about what he had learned, and a flicker of unease about the implications of it all. "Are you leaving soon?" she asked softly, her voice laced with a sadness she couldn't quite hide. She didn't want him to go, though she knew he couldn't stay. Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yes," he said. "I've seen enough to understand what I was missing. People like you, who give without expecting anything in return, are rare and invaluable. You've helped me realize something that will shape my future, how I lead my companies, my charities, everything." Emily's chest tightened at his words. Could it really be possible? Could her small, selfless act influence the decisions of someone so powerful? A spark of hope ignited within her, faint but bright, like a candle flickering in the darkness. Before she could fully process it, he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm but brief. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "It may seem odd, but you've reminded me that decency and compassion can still be found, even in the most unexpected places." Emily blinked back, tears overwhelmed by the moment. "I'm glad I could help," she whispered, her words carrying a weight of genuine gratitude. The night around them felt calm, yet charged with a sense of meaning, as though the universe had briefly paused to mark the occasion. The side door of the diner creaked open, breaking the spell. "Emily, what are you doing out here?" Janice called out, her tone sharp with suspicion. Emily turned instinctively, her heart leaping in surprise. When she looked back, Keanu was already stepping into the shadows, his figure fading into the dim light. She opened her mouth to call out, but the words caught in her throat. In the blink of an eye, he was gone. A sense of being at a crossroads settled over her. She stood there for a moment longer, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her. When she finally walked back inside, her thoughts were racing. She had spoken to Keanu Reeves, learned his secret, and somehow it all felt like a turning point. Would she ever see him again? She wasn't sure. But as she returned to her routine, she knew one thing. Her life had been changed forever. Maybe not. Maybe that was the point all along. Life has a strange way of weaving the extraordinary into the fabric of the ordinary. As Emily finished wiping down the last table and exchanged goodnight waves with Janice, a strange feeling settled over her, a mixture of peace and transformation. She realized something powerful that night. The most profound truths are often hidden in plain sight, and one small act of kindness can ripple through someone's life in ways you'd never expect. She was still reflecting on this when she almost dropped a glass. He had walked in. It had been about a week since their first encounter, but here he was again, clean-shaven, neatly dressed, and exuding an unmistakable air of calm confidence. Keanu Reeves. The man she had fed when he was nearly unrecognizable, now stood in the doorway of the diner, no longer hidden behind a disguise. He wore a crisp jacket over a simple pair of jeans, his hair freshly trimmed and styled. It was surreal. She'd seen that face countless times on TV, but this was different. This moment was real. The diner was quiet, the hum of the afternoon lull hanging in the air. None of the other customers seemed to notice who had just walked in. Janice, busy tallying receipts at the counter, hadn't even looked up. Emily, on the other hand, could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, clutching her notepad tightly. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Keanu looked up, his expression soft and approachable. "Coffee, please," he said, his tone calm and warm. "And whatever special you'd recommend today." For a second, she just stood there, stunned by his humility. There was no fanfare, no cameras, no entourage, just him, quietly seated like any other customer. She nodded quickly and moved to pour his coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she filled the mug. She added a slice of the diner's famous apple pie, placing it gently in front of him. "Here you go," she said, trying to mask the quiver in her voice. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I wanted to thank you properly this time, face to face, no disguises, no secrets." The weight of his gratitude hit her like a tidal wave. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, managing a faint smile. "I'm just glad you're okay," she whispered. "I seem nice." Her emotions were a tangled mess, relief, disbelief, gratitude, and a strange kind of excitement. She watched as he took a sip of the coffee and smiled faintly. Then, without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small white card. He slid it across the table toward her. "If you ever need anything, call this number," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. Emily picked up the card, her eyes scanning the simple text. A phone number, nothing else. No name, no company logo, just a line to him. She looked back at him, speechless, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend the weight of what he had just offered. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. He gave her a small nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. It was a moment of shared understanding, a silent promise. Keanu stood, leaving a generous tip on the table, and made his way toward the door. Janice finally glanced up, her eyes widening as recognition set in. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, too shocked to speak. Keanu paused at the door, turning back one last time. He met Emily's gaze and nodded, a gesture that said, "I won't forget." Then he pushed open the door and stepped out into the world, as quietly as he had arrived. No cameras, no grand speeches, just a simple goodbye. Emily stood frozen, clutching the card in her hand. She couldn't help but feel the enormity of what had just happened. She had given a meal to a man she thought was homeless, and he had come back, not as the billionaire the world knew, but as someone profoundly human, to express his gratitude. Her chest swelled with warmth, a mixture of awe and disbelief. She now carried a story that no one would believe, but it didn't matter. The truth lived in her heart. That day, her world shifted in ways she couldn't have imagined, all because of one small, compassionate act.